Picture this alone knight, clad in gleaming armor, standing victorious atop a mountain of defeated foes. His name echoes through the ages, celebrated in songs and chronicles as the epitome of bravery and virtue. But what if that image, burned into our collective memory, isn't the whole truth? Medieval chronicles, the very sources we rely on to tell these heroic tales, were often filled with exaggerations, political agendas, and outright fabrications. The legends of King Arthur, Richard the Lionheart, and other iconic figures were shaped by scribes who weren't just recording history, they were crafting myths. And those myths have stubbornly clung to our imagination, blurring the line between fact and fiction. Why does this gap between legend and reality matter? Because these stories aren't just entertainment, they've shaped how we view courage, leadership, and even morality. When we peel back the layers of exaggeration, we uncover something far more fascinating: the messy, complicated humans behind the legends. What if your favorite hero wasn't the flawless paragon of chivalry you've been led to believe? What if their greatest battles weren't against dragons or rival armies, but against their own flaws and the biases of the chroniclers who immortalized them? This isn't just about correcting the historical record, it's about understanding how storytelling itself can twist reality, turning flesh and blood individuals into symbols that serve a purpose far beyond their actual lives. Today, we're embarking on a journey through the tangled web of medieval chronicles to separate fact from fiction. We'll explore how scribes, often under the patronage of powerful rulers, embellished deeds to glorify their patrons or push political agendas. We'll meet heroes whose reputations were inflated beyond recognition and uncover the quieter, more nuanced truths buried beneath centuries of myth-making. Along the way, you'll discover how these distortions reveal as much about the people who wrote them as the figures they wrote about. This isn't just a dive into history, it's a detective story, one that challenges everything you thought you knew about the medieval world's most celebrated warriors. So, are you ready to see these legendary figures in a whole new light? Let's begin. Take the medieval chronicler, part historian, part storyteller, often with a quill in one hand and an agenda in the other. These weren't neutral observers jotting down events as they happened. Many were monks tucked away in monasteries, or court historians whose livelihoods depended on pleasing wealthy patrons. Their accounts weren't just records, they were carefully crafted narratives designed to flatter, persuade, or even preach. Imagine a scribe writing about a king's battle victories while that very king's gold paid for his ink and parchment. How objective do you think that chronicle would be? Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain is a perfect example. Written in the 12th century, it transformed King Arthur from a shadowy warlord into a mythic hero battling giants and wielding Excalibur. But here's the catch: Geoffrey's work was less about history and more about creating a glorious origin story for Britain, one that could rival the epic tales of Rome. He freely mixed folklore, legend, and his own imagination, passing it all off as fact. And because his version was so thrilling, it stuck, drowning out quieter, more plausible accounts. The problem wasn't just creativity, it was access. Chroniclers rarely witnessed battles firsthand. Instead, they relied on second-hand reports, rumors, or even the boasts of soldiers. A skirmish might become a grand siege. A minor noble's bravery might grow into a tale of solo heroics against impossible odds. Drama sold, and these writers knew it. But the distortions went deeper than flair. Many monastic chroniclers framed events through a moral or religious lens, turning conflicts into cosmic struggles between good and evil. A king who clashed with the church might suddenly find his victories downplayed or his sins exaggerated. These biases didn't just tweak details, they created entirely new realities. Over generations, the snowball effect turned small exaggerations into grand legends until the line between man and myth vanished. So the next time you hear a stirring tale of medieval heroism, ask yourself, who wrote this? And what did they have to gain? Because behind every legendary warrior, there's often a chronicler with a motive. El Cid stands tall in Spanish legend, a warrior so mighty that even death couldn't stop him from leading his troops to victory, if the Chronicles are to be believed. But dig a little deeper, and the cracks in this flawless image start to show. The Historia Rodrisi, the oldest account of his life, paints him as a master tactician who never faltered. Yet archaeology tells a different story. At the siege of Valencia, traces of hastily abandoned positions and scorched earth suggest panic, not the cool-headed brilliance of legend. And what about his infamous exile? Chronicles frame it as a noble stand against injustice, but court records hint at a more complicated truth: political missteps, broken alliances, even accusations of embezzlement. Why would scribes airbrush these stumbles from the record? Because El Cid wasn't just a man, he was a symbol. By the time his legend solidified, Spain was deep in the Reconquista, desperate for heroes who could embody Christian resilience against Islamic rule. His chroniclers weren't just writing history, they were crafting propaganda. Every omitted defeat, every exaggerated victory served a purpose: to turn a skilled but fallible mercenary into an invincible icon. This myth-making wasn't unique to Spain. Look at Joan of Arc, whose chroniclers downplayed her military failures to emphasize divine favor, or Saladin, whose defeats were recast as moral victories. Societies don't just want heroes, they need them to be perfect, because their flaws force us to confront uncomfortable truths. What does it say about us when we'd rather believe in an unblemished legend than a real person who stumbled, adapted, and sometimes failed? The irony is that these flaws often reveal the most fascinating dimensions of these figures. El Cid's exile, far from diminishing him, shows his ability to reinvent himself, an exiled knight who became a mercenary, then a ruler. His real genius wasn't invincibility, it was resilience, but that nuanced truth gets lost when chronicles reduce heroes to one-dimensional paragons. So why do we cling to these myths? Perhaps because perfection is simpler than reality. A flawless hero is a rallying point, a banner to unite under. But in sanding away their humanity, we rob these figures, and ourselves, of something far more valuable: the lesson that greatness isn't the absence of failure, but the ability to rise from it. And that raises another question. If heroism isn't about perfection, what does define it? The answer lies not in the grand legends, but in the messy, evolving ways societies have reinterpreted these figures across centuries. Numbers in medieval chronicles often read more like fantasy than fact. Take the legendary Battle of Agincourt. English accounts claim Henry V's outnumbered forces slaughtered 10,000 French knights while losing barely 100 of their own. On paper, it's a staggering feat of military genius, but the reality, feeding an army of 10,000 in 15th century France, would have been a logistical nightmare, let alone fielding one in muddy terrain where movement was nearly impossible. Modern estimates suggest French casualties were closer to 6,000, with English losses triple what chroniclers admitted. So why the wild exaggeration? Victors didn't just write history, they inflated it. Big numbers served as propaganda, transforming messy battles into divine endorsements. When a chronicler claimed a hero like Roland slew 400 Saracens single-handedly at Roncesvalles, It wasn't a factual report, it was a sermon. Those impossible kill counts reinforced cultural myths, that God favored the righteous, that one virtuous warrior could tip the scales of fate. Never mind that swinging a sword non-stop for hours is physically implausible, or that even elite troops would collapse from exhaustion long before hitting triple digits. The message mattered more than math. Logistics exposed these tall tales, marching 100,000 men across medieval Europe, as some chronicles claimed Charlemagne would have stripped the land bare of food and clean water. Armies rarely exceeded 20,000 because supply chains couldn't support more, yet numbers ballooned in retellings, turning rival forces into inhuman hordes to make victories seem miraculous. The Song of Antioch, for instance, describes crusaders defeating 600,000 Muslims, a figure surpassing the entire population of the region. These weren't innocent errors. Downplaying friendly casualties boosted morale. Exaggerating enemy losses justified future campaigns. When Richard the Lionheart's chroniclers claimed he killed thousands at Arsuf, they weren't documenting, they were recruiting. Every inflated statistic whispered to listeners, "Join us and you'll share in this glory." But the biggest casualty wasn't accuracy, it was perspective. By reducing wars to epic duels and impossible numbers, chroniclers erased the grimmer truths of medieval combat, disease, starvation, and the anonymous thousands who died without a scribe to tally them. Which raises another question: if numbers were twisted so freely, what else was fabricated? Take the way Chronicles portrayed women warriors, vanishing their achievements into footnotes while inventing flaws for those who couldn't be ignored. The same quills that turned men into demigods often reduced women to cautionary tales or romantic props, but that's a distortion with consequences far beyond inflated body counts. Consider Joan of Arc, burned at the stake as a heretic, then reborn in Chronicles as a saintly maiden guided by angels. Her transformation from military leader to divine messenger wasn't accidental. Medieval scribes couldn't reconcile a peasant girl outmaneuvering seasoned generals, so they reframed her brilliance as heavenly intervention. Compare that to Matilda of Tuscany, who commanded armies in the 11th century, personally leading sieges and outwitting emperors. Yet her chroniclers reduced her to a pious widow, emphasizing her prayers over her battlefield tactics. The pattern is clear. Women who couldn't be ignored were either sanctified or scandalized, but almost never acknowledged as straightforward strategists. Look at the Gesta Stephani, a 12th century chronicle that grudgingly admits Empress Matilda's political acumen, only to undercut it by painting her as haughty and unlikable. Or take the Chronicle of Fredegar, which spins the Frankish Queen Brunhilde's 40-year reign into a lurid tale of witchcraft and murder. Even when women held real power, their stories were filtered through a lens that couldn't fathom female authority unless wrapped in morality tales. A warrior queen became a shield maiden to soften her image. A savvy diplomat became a peace weaver to fit domestic tropes. The Song of Roland offers a telling example. Its only significant female character, Alda, exists solely to die of grief upon hearing of Roland's death, a prop for male heroism. Contrast that with historical accounts of Sicilgata of Salerno, who fought alongside her husband Robert Guiscard in full armor, rallying troops mid-battle. Yet her chroniclers fixated on her beauty rather than her battlefield commands. This wasn't just omission, it was active reshaping. When women's victories couldn't be erased, they were romanticized into submission. What does this rewriting reveal? That medieval notions of heroism were tightly bound to gender. A man's flaws could be glorified as complexity, while a woman's strengths had to be sanitized or sensationalized. But the bias ran deeper than gender alone. Just as scribes filtered women's stories through patriarchal expectations, they reshaped heroes' origins to fit class hierarchies. The lowborn knight who rose to greatness, often reinvented as a secret noble. The peasant rebellion leader, erased entirely or recast as a villain. The parchment was never neutral. It was a battleground for who got to be remembered and how. So next time you encounter a medieval hero, ask, who wasn't allowed to be heroic, and what does that silence tell us about the hands that held the quills? Because the gaps in these chronicles speak as loudly as the words. The battlefield wasn't just a stage for knights in shining armor. It was a crowded, chaotic place where peasants and commoners fought and died by the thousands. Yet you'd never know it from medieval chronicles. Take the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302, where Flemish militia, armed with little more than pikes and grit, slaughtered an army of French knights. It was a seismic moment, proving that disciplined commoners could topple the feudal elite. So how did contemporary chroniclers memorialize it? By focusing on the handful of nobles who didn't flee, turning the battle into yet another chivalric duel. The Flemish foot soldiers who actually won the day, reduced to a faceless mob in the background. This wasn't an oversight, it was by design. Feudal societies relied on the myth that only the noble-born could be true warriors. Chroniclers, often funded by those same aristocrats, had every reason to downplay peasant contributions. Why glorify the rabble when you could spin tales of a lone knight's valor? The Chronique de Flandre barely mentions the pikemen who formed the Flemish wall, instead fixating on the noble bearing of French commanders even as they lay trampled in the mud. The message was clear: bravery belonged to the privileged, and the rest were just extras in someone else's story. But dig deeper, and you'll find commoners everywhere the chronicles pretend they weren't. At Crécy, English longbowmen, many of them yeoman farmers, decimated French cavalry with volleys so thick they darkened the sky. Yet Froissart's chronicle treats them as human ballistae, nameless machines rather than men. Even when peasants saved the day, like the Swiss halberdiers who shattered Burgundian knights at Morat, scribes reframed their victories as flukes or miracles. A noble's death was tragic, a peasant's was statistics. This bias didn't just erase individuals, it reinforced an entire worldview. If only nobles could be heroes, then their dominance was natural, even divine. Never mind that most medieval armies were majority peasant levies, or that castles were built by anonymous masons, not the lords who took credit. The chronicles were less histories than advertisements for feudalism, selling the idea that bloodline dictated worth. Imagine how different our understanding of the Middle Ages would be if chroniclers had given equal ink to the baker who held a gate at Jerusalem, or the wool weaver whose pike saved a flank at Agincourt. Would we still romanticize chivalry if we knew how much it relied on invisible labor? The irony is that by silencing common soldiers, these accounts missed the real drama. Ordinary people thrust into extraordinary moments, their courage rewritten out of existence. And just as class distorted these records, so did religion. Because if chroniclers could ignore the peasant beside them, they could certainly vilify the heathen across the battlefield. When the tide of battle turned unexpectedly, medieval chroniclers often reached for the heavens rather than human ingenuity to explain it. Take the Battle of Mons in 987, where Otto II's forces, outnumbered and exhausted, suddenly routed their enemies. Contemporary accounts don't credit clever tactics or terrain. They describe angelic warriors descending from the clouds, swords blazing, to smite Otto's foes. Never mind that Otto had spent months forging alliances with local lords. In the Chronicles, his victory became a divine endorsement, proof that God favored the pious. This wasn't just colorful storytelling, it was a deliberate erasure of real strategy, reducing complex campaigns to cosmic morality plays. The pattern stretches back centuries. Pagan chronicles had done much the same, crediting victories to Odin's ravens or Zeus's thunderbolts. When Clovis defeated the Alemanni in 496, Bishop Gregory of Tours claimed the Frankish king won only after vowing to convert to Christianity, as if the battle hinged on baptism rather than battlefield maneuvers. These weren't neutral observations, they were recruitment tools. A victory framed as miraculous wasn't just a win, it was propaganda, proof that your side had the gods or God on its side. Small wonder rulers encouraged these tales. Nothing cemented authority like claiming celestial backup, but the cost of these divine plot twists was real. Take the Crusades, where chroniclers like Fulcher of Chartres spun every setback into a test of faith and every success into a miracle. At Antioch, when starving crusaders stumbled upon a hidden cache of food, it wasn't reconnaissance that saved them, it was the Holy Lance divinely revealed. Never mind that local spies had likely tipped them off, the miracle made better copy. The same pen that erased Muslim commanders' tactical brilliance, Saladin's masterful feigned retreats at Hattin, for instance, also erased Christian leaders' actual cleverness, like Baldwin IV's use of the terrain at Montjesard. The irony, these heavenly interventions often masked the era's most fascinating military innovations. The Norman victory at Hastings in 1066 wasn't just about William's holy banner. It hinged on disciplined feigned retreats, a tactic borrowed from Byzantine manuals. But the Bayeux Tapestry shows halos, not hand signals. Even chroniclers who witnessed battles firsthand, like Jean de Joinville at Louis IX's Crusades, filtered events through a religious lens. A sudden storm that saved the day, not luck, providence, disease that decimated the enemy camp, not poor sanitation, divine wrath. This habit of crediting the supernatural didn't just skew history, it shaped future wars. Why study logistics or diplomacy when victory was guaranteed to the righteous? The disastrous Children's Crusade, launched on the belief that purity alone could conquer Jerusalem, stands as a grim testament to where such thinking led. Yet the allure persists. Modern retellings still lean on these tropes, from films where heroes win through destiny rather than drills to politicians invoking manifest destiny. The medieval scribes might be long gone, but their legacy lingers in our stubborn desire to replace messy reality with clean, comforting myths. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in what these chronicles ignored. For every angelic host they conjured, there was a real scout riding through the night, a quartermaster stretching supplies, or a sergeant drilling recruits. The miracles made legends, but the unrecorded labor made history. And that raises an uncomfortable question. How many other breakthroughs, medical, technological, even social, have we airbrushed into divine intervention simply because acknowledging human effort feels less thrilling? The ink of medieval chronicles didn't just record enemies, it weaponized them. Viking raids were framed as mindless waves of bloodthirsty brutes, Muslim armies as fanatical hordes, and pagan tribes as subhuman savages. But archaeology tells a different story entirely. Excavations from Dublin to Damascus reveal trading networks where Norse merchants haggled peacefully with Anglo-Saxons. Moorish scholars exchanged medical texts with Christian monks, and so-called barbarians crafted jewelry rivaling royal treasuries. So why the disconnect? Because dehumanization wasn't an accident, it was strategy. Take the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which paints Vikings as one-dimensional reavers who lived only to pillage. Yet Viking settlements like Jorvik thrived as multicultural hubs where Scandinavians, Celts, and Anglo-Saxons intermarried and traded. Even the notorious Great Heathen Army left behind evidence of negotiated land deals alongside their battles. Similarly, Crusader chronicles reduced Muslim adversaries to caricatures lustful, treacherous, or cowardly. while ignoring Salah ad-Din's famed chivalry or the sophistication of Cordoba's libraries. These weren't oversights, they were narrative tools. By stripping enemies of complexity, chroniclers made conquest feel righteous, even inevitable. The contrast with physical evidence is stark. A Viking grave in Scotland holds a comb inscribed with both Norse runes and a Gaelic prayer. A Frankish knight's tomb near Jerusalem contains a silk sash woven with Arabic blessings. These artifacts whisper of cultural borrowing that parchment refused to acknowledge, because admitting your enemy was nuanced, that they prayed fervently, loved their children, or valued honor made killing them harder. It's no coincidence that the Song of Roland transforms Muslim troops into grotesque giants with fangs, while actual Andalusian poets were composing verses about shared stars and fleeting life. This demonization served a clear political purpose. When Charlemagne slaughtered Saxon prisoners at Verdun, his chroniclers framed it as a holy necessity, never mind that Saxons had allied with him years earlier. When Norman invaders described Anglo-Saxons as barbarous to justify their conquest, they glossed over England's thriving monasteries and legal codes. Othering the enemy wasn't just about fear, it was about erasing guilt. If they weren't fully human, taking their lands wasn't theft. If they were monstrous, slaughter wasn't murder. And just as enemies were simplified into fiends, heroes' darkest acts were scrubbed clean. Richard the Lionheart's massacre of 2,600 Muslim prisoners at Acre becomes a hard choice in Christian chronicles. The Vikings who settled Normandy, once reviled as butchers, miraculously transformed into noble Franks once their duke claimed a crown. The quill was as mighty as the sword. It could turn pirates into princes, ethnic cleansing into evangelism, and war crimes into unfortunate necessities. But here's the twist: sometimes the truth leaked through. William of Malmesbury, writing decades after Hastings, admits that Norman knights acted more like tyrants than conquerors, burning villages and starving rebels. The Alexiad, penned by a Byzantine princess, portrays crusaders not as gallant liberators but as greedy opportunists. These rare cracks in the facade remind us that even medieval audiences knew propaganda when they saw it. The real question isn't why chroniclers lied, it's why we're still so willing to believe them. After all, the urge to paint our side as blameless and our foes as inhuman didn't end with parchment and quills. It just found new mediums. Charlemagne, crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800, is remembered as the father of Europe, a unifier, a patron of learning, a near-saintly figure. But flip to the margins of those glowing chronicles, and you'll find whispers of something darker. The Saxon Wars, which dragged on for 3 decades, weren't just a clash of cultures, they were a campaign of terror. Contemporary Frankish accounts skip lightly over the mass executions, like the 4,500 Saxon prisoners beheaded in a single day at Verdun. Instead, they dwell on Charlemagne's piety, his church building, his supposed reluctance to fight. It's as if the scribes took a knife to history itself, carving away anything that didn't fit the image of a Christian king. Now compare that to the Royal Frankish Annals, which admits the massacre only in passing, framing it as a necessary evil. Then read the Saxon poet's lament, describing children starved to death during Frankish sieges, or the archaeological evidence of villages burned so thoroughly that the soil still holds layers of charcoal. The gap between these accounts isn't just bias, it's deliberate erasure. Charlemagne's chroniclers weren't documenting history, they were crafting an origin myth for Christendom, one where violence was always justified, always holy. This wasn't unique to the Franks. Look at how Byzantine chronicles sanitized Justinian's reconquest of Italy, glossing over the famine that followed his armies. Or how English accounts of Henry V's campaigns in France omit the systematic razing of towns, focusing instead on his pious speeches. The pattern is relentless. The greater the hero, the heavier the silence around his crimes. And it wasn't just about protecting reputations, it was about maintaining the fiction that power and virtue were inseparable. If a king chosen by God could commit atrocities, what did that say about the divine order itself? The cognitive dissonance is staggering. These chronicles weep over the death of a single knight but shrug at villages put to the sword. They'll spend pages describing a king's humility in washing beggars' feet, then skip the clause in his tax edicts that let soldiers seize peasants' last goats. It's not that scribes were ignorant. Court records and treasury rolls often held the ugly truth. But selective amnesia was a survival skill. A monk writing under royal patronage knew exactly which stories earned a meal and which earned a dungeon. Fast forward to modern media, and the game hasn't changed, only the players. Biopics turn conquerors into misunderstood visionaries, their body counts softened by swelling music and noble close-ups. Textbooks still frame colonialism as a civilizing mission, airbrushing genocide into unfortunate incidents. Even video games recast warlords as strategic geniuses, their atrocities reduced to a stat screen. The machinery of myth-making just got slicker. We've swapped parchment for pixels, but the urge to sand away the rough edges of history remains the same. Perhaps the real lesson lies in what these omissions reveal about power. The stories we choose to tell and those we choose to forget aren't just about the past. They're mirrors reflecting who we need our heroes to be, and sometimes the most revealing thing about a legend isn't what's written, but what's carefully, deliberately left out. Imagine being a medieval king with shaky legitimacy, your throne wobbling like a stool with one short leg. Now imagine discovering your great-great-grandfather wasn't just a noble, he was a Trojan prince who fled the burning ruins of Troy itself. That's precisely the audacious claim Frankish chroniclers made for their Merovingian rulers in the 6th century. Never mind that Troy had fallen over 1,000 years earlier, or that the Franks were Germanic tribes with no connection to the Aegean. The Liber Historiae Francorum wove an elaborate fantasy tracing their kings back to Trojan refugees, complete with a fictional hero named Francio who supposedly founded their people. This wasn't just creative storytelling, it was political alchemy, transforming warlords into heirs of antiquity's greatest legends. DNA studies now rip these fabrications to shreds. When researchers analyzed the remains of Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, they found his Y chromosome didn't match living descendants of Edward III, meaning somewhere along the line, someone's royal bloodline was anything but royal. Similar gaps appear in the Carolingian genealogies that proved Charlemagne descended from Hector of Troy. These weren't innocent mistakes, they were power plays. In a world where authority hinged on divine right and ancient pedigree, a splash of mythical ancestry could turn a usurper into a rightful king overnight. But why did bloodlines trump actual achievements? Because lineage was medieval Europe's ultimate currency. A conqueror with a sword could take land, but only a ruler with noble blood could hold it without revolt. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, his chroniclers didn't boast of his military genius. They insisted he was Edward the Confessor's rightful heir through a convoluted, possibly invented kinship tie. Even rebellion leaders played the game. Welsh Prince Owain Glyndwr claimed descent from King Arthur to rally support, while Hungarian kings fabricated ties to Attila the Hun. Blood was the ultimate brand, a pre-modern version of corporate mergers where genealogies were the legal documents. The economics behind these myths are razor-sharp. Land inheritance laws often required proof of noble descent, so fabricated lineages meant real estates and tax revenues. monasteries. The keepers of these records were frequently encouraged to discover flattering connections for their patrons. The Annals of St. Bertin didn't just happen to find Merovingian links to Troy, they were paid to. And when marriages between kingdoms needed justification, scribes could always find a shared ancestor in some dusty scroll. It's no coincidence that the surge in heroic genealogies peaked during periods of territorial expansion, like the Crusades, when new rulers needed instant legitimacy in conquered lands. Yet the most fascinating twist isn't the lies themselves, it's how eagerly people believed them. When Geoffrey of Monmouth revealed British kings descended from Trojan refugee Brutus, even educated clerics treated it as fact. Because in a fractured world, shared myths created unity. A Frankish peasant might grumble about taxes, but if his king was Hector's heir, that was a story worth following. The same impulse drives modern celebrity culture, where fabricated pedigrees from academic degrees to old money backstories still sway public perception. The medium changed, but the game remains identical. Wrap ambition in the glitter of antiquity, and power follows. So next time you see a family tree stretching back to Charlemagne or King David, remember, you're likely seeing less of history and more of medieval PR. Because when it comes to heroism, reality rarely sells as well as a well-placed myth. Behind every glowing chronicle of medieval heroism, there was usually a wealthy patron holding the purse strings and the narrative reins. Take the Gesta Regum Anglorum, a 12th century history of English kings. Its author, William of Malmesbury, openly admitted he softened his criticism of William the Conqueror because the king's grandson, Henry I, was his benefactor. "Some things must be left unsaid," he wrote, "lest we offend living ears." That wasn't just discretion, it was survival. Monks who chronicled royal scandals risked losing their scriptorium's funding or worse. When Gerald of Wales dared to criticize Henry II's court, he found himself exiled to a remote Irish parish, his quill effectively silenced. The church wielded similar control. Bishop Odo of Bayeux commissioned the Bayeux Tapestry not as neutral history, but as propaganda to justify Norman rule over England. Notice how it skips Harold Godwinson's legitimate claim to the throne, or the Norman army's massacre of civilians after Hastings. Meanwhile, the Annals of Fulda, written by monks directly under Charlemagne's influence, glossed over his brutal suppression of Saxon revolts, framing them as divine corrections rather than ethnic cleansing. Dissenters paid dearly. The monk Adema of Chabans was caught inserting his own critiques into manuscripts and was forced to publicly recant, his corrections scraped from the parchment under watchful eyes. Fast forward to today, and the machinery hasn't changed, just the mediums. Medieval kings had their court scribes, modern corporations have PR teams. A pharmaceutical company funding medical studies that downplay side effects isn't so different from a medieval lord paying for a chronicle that omits his battlefield blunders. Social media algorithms burying unflattering news, that's just digital parchment scraping. The real question isn't whether history gets spun, it's who holds the spinning wheel. Geography warped these records just as powerfully as patronage. A French chronicler describing the 100 Years' War saw English troops as invading devils. Across the Channel, those same soldiers were freedom fighters reclaiming ancestral lands. The Chronica Majora by Matthew Paris, written in England, paints Mongol invaders as literal demons with claws, never mind that Paris had never seen one, relying on hysterical rumors from terrified refugees. Meanwhile, Persian accounts of the same Mongols noted their disciplined administration and religious tolerance. Truth wasn't just filtered through bias, it was refracted through distance, turning enemies into monsters and neighbors into saints. Consider how Arab chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir described crusaders as hairy, unwashed barbarians, a stark contrast to European tales of shining knights. Neither was wholly false, but both were incomplete, shaped by what their audiences needed to believe. When Venetian merchants wrote about Constantinople's fall, they emphasized Byzantine treachery to justify sacking the city. Greek historians naturally told a different story. These weren't just perspectives, they were competing realities, each crafted to serve a purpose. So the next time you read a history, medieval or modern, ask yourself, who paid for this version? And what did they lose if the truth got out? Because the parchment might be brittle, but the art of controlling narratives is alive and well. Just look at the stories we're still spinning about heroes and villains today. The ink may have dried centuries ago, but the hands guiding the pen feel eerily familiar. Every culture has its hometown hero, the figure whose legend looms larger within their own valleys than on the world stage. Take William Tell, the Swiss folk hero who supposedly shot an apple off his son's head in defiance of Austrian rule. Swiss chronicles from the 14th century paint him as the ultimate patriot, a lone bowman whose defiance sparked rebellion. Yet cross the Alps into Austria, and contemporary records don't even mention his name. Meanwhile, Norway had its own apple-shot legend with Egil the One-Handed. Wales celebrated the archer Twm Cati, and even the Persian epic Shahnameh features a similar feat by the warrior Arash. So why does Tell's story resonate globally while the others remain local curiosities? Because heroism wasn't just about deeds, it was about who had the quills and patrons to amplify them. The geography of fame followed trade routes and rivalries like ink spreading on parchment. Italian city-states celebrated condottieri like Sir John Hawkwood, mercenaries immortalized in frescoes, while their English homeland forgot them. The Hanseatic League's chronicles glorified merchants who outwitted pirates, but those tales rarely traveled south of the Rhine. Even the Vikings, whose sagas were meticulously preserved in Iceland, became caricatures in French or English accounts, reduced to horn-helmeted brutes rather than the sophisticated traders and explorers archaeology reveals. These weren't innocent omissions. Celebrating local heroes reinforced identity, especially in regions chafing under foreign rule. Tell's apple shot wasn't just a stunt, it was a metaphor for Swiss resistance, carefully nurtured by chroniclers in a land fighting to assert its independence. Maps tell the real story. Compare medieval European accounts of the Mongols depicted as godless demons with Persian or Chinese descriptions praising their administrative genius. Or contrast how Spanish chronicles framed El Cid as a Christian champion, while Arabic sources remembered him as a pragmatic mercenary who served Muslim emirs. The same man, the same battles, but the details shifted like borders on a map. Even saints weren't immune. Saint George slaying the dragon is a universal icon, but dig deeper, and you'll find George's Cartley's tusk have Rebbe claiming him as their own, while Lebanon's Maronite Christians insist the dragon fell in their hills. Heroism, it seems, was the original local business, yet time played the cruelest trick of all. As legends traveled, they shed complicating truths like excess baggage. Tell likely never existed. His first mention comes 2 centuries after his supposed feats, in a chronicle justifying Swiss autonomy. The apple shot itself echoes Norse myths and Saxon folktales, repackaged for a new audience. Meanwhile, figures like Serbia's Miloš Obilic, who supposedly slew the Ottoman Sultan at Kosovo, were inflated from minor nobles into national symbols centuries after their deaths. Distance didn't just distort facts, it erased alternatives. Ask a Venetian about the 13th century, and they'll name the daring explorer Marco Polo. Ask a Mongol and they'll recall the diplomat Rabban Bar Soma who trekked from Beijing to Paris, a journey just as epic but one that never found its chronicler in the West. So whose heroes have we lost because no one wrote them down? The Breton sailor who navigated stormy seas without a compass, the Bengali mathematician whose theorems vanished when invaders burned her university, the African traders who crossed the Sahara but left no chronicles. History isn't just shaped by what's remembered, it's haunted by what's forgotten, and that raises an unsettling thought. If our view of the past is this fractured, how much of today's heroism is already being edited before our eyes? Think of medieval history as a centuries-long game of telephone, where each retelling added another layer of exaggeration until the truth became unrecognizable. Take Roland's horn, Oliphant first mentioned in the early Song of Roland as a simple ivory instrument. By the 12th century, Chronicles described it as a magical artifact capable of summoning angels or splitting mountains. Compare the earliest manuscripts with those written just 200 years later, and you'll find battles that once involved hundreds suddenly featuring tens of thousands, or a knight's modest act of bravery morphing into a divine miracle. These weren't innocent embellishments, they were deliberate upgrades, turning history into legend one scribble flourish at a time. Oral tradition turbocharged this distortion. Before stories were written down, they traveled mouth to ear, changing with each telling like a rumor passed through a crowded tavern. The Icelandic sagas, for instance, began as spoken tales before being transcribed centuries later. Plenty of time for facts to warp into folklore. A real Viking raid led by a minor chieftain might become a clash of supernatural beings by the time it reached parchment. Even when scribes finally recorded these stories, they often sanitized them for their audience. The Nibelungenlied, based on older Germanic oral traditions, transformed the brutal 5th century warlord Attila into a noble king named Etzel, softening his edges to suit medieval courtly tastes. Art and literature piled on the myths. A minor skirmish like the Battle of Roncesvalles, where Basque ambushers killed Roland's rear guard, became a grand last stand against Saracen hordes in the Song of Roland. Later painters added halos, golden armor, and celestial light, none of which appeared in early accounts. Shakespeare did the same for Macbeth, turning a capable 11th century Scottish king into a murderous tyrant under the influence of Elizabethan propaganda. Each adaptation, whether a tapestry, a ballad, or a play, sanded away inconvenient truths to fit the narrative needs of its era. The most telling evidence lies in side-by-side manuscript comparisons. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles' early entries note Viking raids matter-of-factly. In this year, Danes came to Portland, but later versions, rewritten during Norman rule, insert lurid details of monks slaughtered and virgins defiled, details absent from contemporary sources. Similarly, the life of Charlemagne by Einhard starts as a respectful biography, yet later copies mysteriously add miracles, like the emperor's sword glowing with holy fire. These weren't accidents, they were upgrades for a market that demanded ever more dramatic tales. And just when you think the distortions couldn't deepen, folklore got involved. Robin Hood began as a yeoman in early ballads, but by the Tudor era, he'd been rebranded as a disinherited nobleman because a commoner challenging authority was too radical for the aristocracy funding those stories. Even geography wasn't safe. The location of Arthur's Camelot shifted with political borders from Cornwall to Wales to France, depending on who needed a national hero most. What makes this telephone game so fascinating isn't just the scale of the changes, but why they stuck. Embellishments survived because they fed something deeper than curiosity. They fed identity. A people under threat, like the Welsh resisting English rule, clung to an Arthur who'd returned to save them. A church consolidating power needed saints who performed miracles, not ordinary humans who triumphed through grit alone. The myths that lasted weren't the most accurate, but the most useful. And that raises a haunting question. If even the simplest facts could warp beyond recognition in a few generations, how much of what we know about the past is just a reflection of what someone needed us to believe? Paintings and tapestries didn't just depict medieval heroes, they reinvented them stitch by stitch, brushstroke by brushstroke. Take the Song of Roland, where the titular knight is described fighting in gleaming plate armor, a style that wouldn't exist for another 400 years. Artists illustrating these scenes didn't care about historical accuracy. They dressed Roland in the latest 15th century fashion because their patrons wanted to see reflections of their own grandeur. The same anachronisms appear in the Bayeux Tapestry, where Saxon soldiers wield Norman-style swords, or in illuminated manuscripts showing King Arthur in full Renaissance regalia. These weren't mistakes, they were upgrades turning the past into a mirror for the present. Artistic license served deeper purposes than flattery. A tapestry wasn't just decoration, it was propaganda, hung in castle halls to remind visitors of a family's supposed heroic lineage. When Italian painter Paolo Uccello depicted the Battle of San Romano with knights in absurdly ornate armor, he wasn't recreating history, he was selling the Medici family's myth of military brilliance. Even the colors lied. Medieval artists painted crusaders' crosses blazing scarlet, though contemporary accounts described them as simple cloth strips, faded and grimy from travel. Drama sold better than dirt, poetry twisted facts just as boldly. The Chanson de Guillaume turns a minor skirmish into a cosmic clash, with heroes slaying thousands single-handedly. Never mind that swinging a sword for hours would exhaust even the strongest warrior. The audience wanted superhuman feats, not logistics. These embellishments weren't innocent. A patron paying for an epic about his ancestor needed that ancestor to outshine rivals. When a poet described a knight's last stand, he wasn't documenting, he was auditioning for the next commission. Allegory disguised politics in saintly garb. Paintings of St. George slaying the dragon often doubled as commentary on current wars, the dragon's scales suspiciously resembling Ottoman armor, or its fiery breath evoking Islamic siege engines. Artists couldn't criticize kings directly, but they could hint. A tapestry showing Charlemagne forgiving a rebel might subtly urge a current monarch to show mercy. The message was clear. Heroes didn't just belong to the past, they were blueprints for the present. Yet for all their distortions, these works preserved something raw beneath the gilt. The Morgan Bible's illustrations of Mongol warriors, though stylized, capture their composite bow's unique shape, a detail only an eyewitness would know. The Tres Riches Hures du Duc de Berry shows peasants harvesting wheat with sickles identical to those found in French archaeological digs. Even while exaggerating, artists smuggled in truths. That's where archaeology cuts through the varnish. Excavations at Agincourt reveal arrowheads lodged in French knights' remains, confirming English longbow dominance, a fact Chronicles downplayed to spare noble embarrassment. At Visby, mass graves from 1361 show fighters wearing mismatched armor, nothing like the uniform suits in paintings, and at Bosworth Field, the battered skeleton of Richard III, his spine twisted by scoliosis, proves how far Shakespeare's hunchbacked villain strayed from reality. So when does art rewrite history? Whenever power needs a prettier past, but beneath the layers of pigment and poetry, the dirt still whispers the truth. And sometimes the most heroic act is listening to it. Archaeology doesn't just dig up history, it shatters myths. Take the legendary King Arthur's Camelot, a grand castle described in medieval romances as the glittering heart of chivalry. Generations of scholars scoured Britain for its ruins, but not a single stone matches the Chronicles. At Tintagel, the supposed site of Arthur's birth, excavations revealed a thriving 6th century trading post, impressive, but no round table, no towering battlements, just ordinary pottery and fish bones. Meanwhile, the fabled mass graves of fallen knights from Arthur's final battle. Soil analysis shows those pits held nothing more dramatic than collapsed storage cellars. Science strips away romantic layers with cold precision. Isotope analysis, a technique that reads chemical signatures in teeth and bones, has rewritten entire chapters of medieval warfare. When researchers tested skeletons from the Battle of Towton in 1461, one of England's bloodiest conflicts, they made a startling discovery. Many so-called English soldiers had isotope ratios matching Norway and Ireland, proving mercenaries fought in far greater numbers than Chronicles admitted. Another study of Viking burial sites in England revealed something equally shocking. Half the remains were likely local Anglo-Saxons who'd adopted Norse culture. The sagas never mentioned assimilation, they preferred tales of pure-blooded conquerors. Even battlefield archaeology dismantles grand narratives. Metal detector surveys at the site of the Battle of Bosworth, where Richard III fell, found cannon shots scattered wildly beyond the official account's neat battle lines. The fighting was messier, more chaotic than Tudor historians claimed, and at Agincourt, soil samples revealed the famous mud that bogged down French knights wasn't some divine intervention. It was ordinary autumn rain mixing with heavily churned earth from thousands of trampling feet. The real gut punch comes from forensic anthropology, those heroic descriptions of knights dying cleanly from sword strokes. Skeletal evidence tells a grimmer story. At Visby, a mass grave from 1361 shows fighters with multiple healed fractures, proof they survived brutal battles only to be butchered later, likely executed after surrender. The Chronicles called it a glorious victory, the bones call it a war crime. So if science can debunk Arthur and rewrite battles, what else might we have wrong? Take the Vikings, long painted as mindless raiders, yet their settlements show intricate trade networks reaching Baghdad and Byzantium. Or consider the Templars, accused of heresy in sensational trials. Their excavated chapels contain nothing more sinister than well-worn prayer books. Which brings us to history's greatest irony. Sometimes the real villains weren't who the Chronicles claimed. Take Richard III, Shakespeare's hunchbacked monster. His rediscovered skeleton proved the scoliosis that supposedly symbolized his twisted soul was barely noticeable in life, while forensic analysis of the princes in the tower, his alleged victims, suggests they may have outlived him. The Tudors, it seems, were the true masters of medieval spin. Perhaps the most shocking truth archaeology reveals isn't about the past at all, but about how willingly we believe the stories that suit us. Saladin, the legendary Muslim sultan who recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, exists in two parallel worlds. In Crusader Chronicles, he's a scheming infidel who desecrated holy sites, yet Islamic accounts describe the same man ensuring Christian pilgrims safe passage and sending ice to treat King Richard's fever. The gap between these portrayals isn't just bias, it's a masterclass in how history gets written by the side holding the quill. Dig into the archives and you'll find letters between Saladin and Richard exchanging gifts and battlefield compliments, courtesies scrubbed from European propaganda. When the Sultan sent fresh fruit to Richard during a truce, English chroniclers spun it as poison. Arab scribes recorded it as chivalry. The man didn't change, only the lens through which he was seen. This duality wasn't unique to Saladin. Byzantine Emperor Nikephoros II, celebrated in Greek texts as the White Death of the Saracens, appears in Arab chronicles as a bloodthirsty brute who burned mosques. Yet his personal correspondence reveals peace treaties with Muslim rulers and even admiration for their architecture. The Alexiad, penned by Byzantine Princess Anna Komnene, admits Crusaders looted Christian cities more viciously than Muslim ones, a fact omitted from Latin accounts. These contradictions expose a raw truth. Heroism and villainy were never inherent traits, but branding decisions made by chroniclers with agendas. Language barriers amplified the distortions. When Latin scribes translated Arabic accounts of battles, subtle nuances vanished. The Arabic term mujahid, meaning one who strives, became fanatic in Crusader texts. Persian poetry praising Saladin's mercy was dismissed as heathen flattery. Even simple gestures were lost in translation, like when Saladin ordered the minbar of the Al-Aqsa Mosque dismantled to avoid provoking Crusaders, an act of restraint misreported in Europe as sacrilege. The same quills that turned Muslim physicians into sorcerers and Arab astronomers into heretics couldn't or wouldn't convey the intellectual exchanges happening in places like Toledo, where Christian scholars eagerly translated Islamic medical texts. The real casualty wasn't just accuracy, it was the shared humanity these omissions erased. A Frankish knight's diary, buried in a monastic library, mentions trading jokes with a Muslim merchant over chess. A Genoese sailor's log praises the efficiency of Egyptian dockworkers. These fleeting moments of mutual respect rarely made the official record, crowded out by tales of cosmic clashes between good and evil. So who gets to decide who's heroic? The answer lies not in the past, but in who controls the narrative today. Because the same forces that painted Saladin as demon or saint still shape how we label heroes and villains, just with keyboards instead of quills. And that raises an unsettling question. If medieval chronicles could twist reality so completely, what myths are we swallowing whole right now? A single mistranslated word could turn a hero into a villain overnight. Take the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry for the year 793, where Viking raiders were initially described as Wisinga, a neutral term meaning sea traders. But by the time Norman scribes copied the text 2 centuries later, that word became Wisingers, a loaded term closer to pirates or heathen marauders. That subtle shift didn't just change the tone, it rewrote England's entire relationship with its past. Suddenly, complex cultural exchanges became one-dimensional tales of barbarism, all because one scribe's quill slipped. Names suffered the worst distortions. The Frankish king Charles the Bald wasn't bald at all. The Latin Calvus likely referred to his short hair, a style common among nobles. But mistranslation turned it into a mocking nickname that stuck for centuries. Worse still was the conflation of leaders. Arabic chronicles mention a fearsome Norse chieftain named Ruz, possibly Rurik, founder of the Kievan Rus. Byzantine scribes, misreading their sources, transformed him into two separate figures, one a noble ally, the other a savage invader. The ripple effects lasted generations, with some Russian historians still untangling the mess. Battle names became propaganda through translation errors. The Battle of Brunanburh, a pivotal 10th century clash, appears in Irish annals as Bruin Bearn, a gap of the waters. But English chroniclers, mishearing or perhaps preferring drama, rendered it Brunan's fort, inventing a fictional defender to frame the fight as a heroic last stand. Meanwhile, Norse sagas called it Vinheither, more of wine, possibly referring to blood-soaked fields. 3 names, 3 agendas, none likely accurate. Modern translators face minefields with medieval terminology. The Old English then could mean anything from servant to noble warrior, depending on context. When a 12th century monk described Harold Godwinson's forces at Hastings as Ceolas, did he mean proud freeholders or lowly peasants? The choice shapes whether we see the English army as determined citizen soldiers or a rabble outmatched by Norman professionalism. Even colors betray bias. Latin rufus might mean red-haired, ruddy-complexioned, or when applied to enemies, fiery-tempered. The most insidious manipulations involved titles. Arabic Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the faithful, became tyrant in Crusader Chronicles, while the Byzantine Basilius was downgraded to mere king by Western rivals refusing to acknowledge imperial equality. And let's not forget poor El Cid, whose Arabic honorific as Sayyid, the Lord, was twisted by Christian scribes into Campidor, battlemaster, erasing his diplomatic ties to Muslim rulers. Perhaps the greatest casualty of these linguistic games is nuance. When a single term like barbarous could mean foreigner, uncivilized, or satanic, depending on the scribe's agenda, entire cultures got flattened into caricatures. The parchment may have yellowed, but the power of a loaded word remains undimmed, a lesson worth remembering next time you hear history's echoes in today's headlines. A name could make or break a medieval hero's legacy, sometimes literally. Take Richard the Lionheart, a nickname that conjures images of a fearless warrior king. But here's the twist, that title didn't appear until decades after his death. Contemporary chronicles simply called him Ricardus Rex, Richard the King. It was later poets who slapped on Lionheart, borrowing from folklore about lions symbolizing courage. The irony, Richard spent barely 6 months of his reign in England, yet the nickname cemented him as the ultimate English hero. Meanwhile, his brother John got stuck with Lackland, a mocking jab at his lost territories, a label that stuck so hard it overshadowed his legal reforms and administrative genius. Nicknames were weapons as sharp as swords. William the Conqueror's contemporaries knew him as the Bastard, a blunt reference to his illegitimate birth. But after Hastings, Norman chroniclers quietly scrubbed that title, replacing it with the Conqueror to legitimize his rule. The same pattern repeats across Europe. Byzantine Empress Irene was called the Athenian to emphasize her Greek roots when it suited political agendas, then the Wicked when she dared to rule alone. Even saintly titles were strategic. Saint Louis IX of France wasn't called the Pious until his canonization campaign needed a halo. His actual reign featured brutal anti-Jewish pogroms and disastrous crusades. Some nicknames were pure propaganda. The Viking ruler Harald Hardrada's name meant hard ruler, a badge of strength, until Saxon scribes twisted it into Hardrada, implying cruelty. The Spanish Queen Isabella the Catholic earned her title posthumously, a reward for expelling Muslims and Jews, while her husband Ferdinand avoided any the bloody labels despite equal ruthlessness. Gender played a role too. Women rulers like Matilda of Flanders got stuck with the Good Queen or the Handsome, reducing their political savvy to domestic virtues, while male counterparts were the Great or the Bold. But the most fascinating nicknames are the invented ones. Charles the Simple of France wasn't foolish. Simplex meant straightforward in medieval Latin, a dig at his refusal to play political games. Later historians mistranslated it, turning a nuanced leader into a laughingstock. Similarly, Bloody Mary, Tudor's moniker, didn't emerge until Protestant polemics centuries later. Her own subjects called her the Catholic. These labels weren't just descriptions, they were verdicts handed down by chroniclers with axes to grind. And what of the names left unsaid? The chronicles are eerily silent on how these figures might have referred to themselves. Did Richard truly relish the lion imagery, or did he privately wince at the weight of expectation it carried? We'll never know, because mental health, the toll of constant war, the strain of leadership wasn't deemed worthy of parchment. Knights could be the brave or the fearless, but never the exhausted or the haunted. The quills that immortalized their battles left no room for their scars. Medieval chronicles paint warriors as fearless automatons, hacking through battles without a flicker of emotion, yet archaeology tells a darker story. Excavations at mass graves like those from the Battle of Visby reveal skeletons with healed fractures over old wounds, evidence of men who fought through pain long before their final, brutal ends. A knight's armor might gleam in tapestries, but his bones whisper of chronic agony, of shoulders dislocated from years of swinging heavy swords, of teeth ground down to stubs from clenched jaws. These weren't unfeeling machines. They were flesh and blood men who bled, screamed, and likely woke gasping from nightmares we'd now recognize as PTSD. But you'd never know it from the Chronicles. To scribes, trauma wasn't worth ink unless it served a moral lesson. A king's sorrow over lost troops showed piety, while a common soldier's panic was cowardice. Compare this silence to modern veterans' memoirs, where the psychological toll of combat is laid bare. A medieval knight's trembling hands after a siege would have been dismissed as weakness, while today we understand the tremor of hypervigilance. The Song of Roland glorifies its hero blowing his horn until his temples burst, a metaphor for fatal devotion, yes, but also a grotesque celebration of self-destruction. Contrast that with contemporary accounts like On Killing by Dave Grossman, which dissects the lifelong guilt many soldiers carry after taking lives. Medieval warriors likely grappled with the same moral injuries, but without the language or societal permission to voice them. Their suffering was either erased or repackaged as divine trials, like the Chanson d'Antioche describing crusaders' insomnia as Satan's temptations rather than trauma. The cost of this glorification echoes today. By framing agony as nobility, Chronicles created a template for heroism that equates suffering with virtue, a template still weaponized in boot camps and corporate cultures alike. When the Knight's Tale depicts a wounded warrior refusing morphine to die like a man, it's not just drama, it's propaganda. Modern studies show veterans who internalize these warrior myths resist seeking help, fearing stigma. The same cultural script that made medieval knights bite down on leather during amputations now pressures soldiers to suck it up, perpetuating cycles of silent suffering. And what of those who broke under the strain? The Chronicles mock them as cowards, but court records hint at quieter tragedies. A 13th century French legal roll mentions a knight forfeiting his lands after losing his wits, following the Albigensian Crusade, likely a PTSD breakdown. In Spain, a mercenary's contract was voided for melancholia, a term that might now read as depression. These weren't exceptions, they were the rule, scrubbed from heroic narratives because they undermined the myth of the fearless warrior. The most insidious legacy, how these myths fueled reckless ideals. When chroniclers described Richard the Lionheart charging into battle without armor to inspire his men, they weren't just recording history, they were setting a standard. Young nobles raised on these tales emulated their heroes, leading to disasters like the charge of the Light Brigade, where romanticized bravery trumped tactics. Even now, the allure of the heroic last stand distorts military strategy from Thermopylae to Black Hawk Down. The parchment and the silver screen share the same lie, that valor means suffering in silence, and that the only wounds that matter are the ones that bleed. Perhaps the most tragic irony lies in what we've lost by ignoring medieval trauma. Beneath the layers of varnish and verse, there are fleeting glimpses of real compassion. like Saladin sending physicians to treat captured crusaders, or the Norse sagas acknowledging a warrior's battle fog that left him shaking for days. These fragments suggest that people back then understood trauma far better than their chroniclers let on. But when history gets written by the victors get to dictate not just what happened, but how it should feel. And that, more than any sword stroke, might be the deepest wound these warriors carried. The glorification of reckless bravery didn't end with the Middle Ages. It simply traded parchment for propaganda reels. Medieval chronicles celebrated knights who charged alone into enemy lines as paragons of courage, but modern militaries still award medals for similar acts of near-suicidal daring. The Victoria Cross, America's Medal of Honor, even France's Légion d'honneur often go to soldiers who defied impossible odds, echoing the same toxic trope that valorizes self-destruction over strategy. Drill sergeants still invoke Thermopylae and Agincourt as ideals, as if dying pointlessly were nobler than surviving tactically. The Chanson de Roland's hero blowing his horn until his skull cracks finds its parallel in today's pain is weakness leaving the body boot camp mantras, where endurance is fetishized and vulnerability stigmatized. Some cultures recognize the trap earlier. Byzantine military manuals like the Strategicon explicitly warned against lone charges, praising commanders who kept formations tight and avoided unnecessary risks. The Ottomans reserved their highest honors not for berserkers, but for officers who brought their men home alive. Even the Vikings, despite their bloodthirsty reputation, valued cunning over brute force. Their sagas celebrate warriors like Egil Skallagrimsson, who faked madness to escape a hopeless fight, as much as those who died with swords in hand. Compare that to the Gesta Francorum, where crusaders who burned their own ships to force a win at Antioch were hailed as heroes, never mind that the act stranded thousands in hostile territory. The difference wasn't in courage, but in what each society defined as true strength, blind fury or adaptable resilience. The psychological toll of these expectations lingers. Medieval knights swore oaths to never retreat, binding them to fights they couldn't win, a mindset that echoes in modern refusal to withdraw from unwinnable wars, long after logic demands it. Chroniclers painted suicidal last stands as glorious, but archaeology tells a grimmer story. At the Battle of Wisby, mass graves reveal fighters with old, healed wounds, men who'd survived previous battles only to be thrown into another meat grinder for the sake of honor. Today's veterans grapple with the same dissonance, praised as heroes for sacrificing their bodies and minds, then abandoned by systems that romanticized their suffering. The medieval monk scribbling, "God favored the bold," and the contemporary recruiter shouting, "Be all you can be," are selling the same dangerous myth, that worth is measured in scars. Yet alternatives existed even then. The Swiss pikemen of the 15th century won battles through discipline, not individual glory. Their chronicles celebrate formations holding firm, not knights going rogue. Japanese samurai, despite their Bushido code, practiced Kujutsu, the art of tactical withdrawal, knowing survival served their lord better than a corpse's empty valor. These exceptions prove the rule. Toxic heroism wasn't inevitable, but a choice reinforced by those who benefited from it. Kings needed young men to die for crowns. Arms dealers needed wars to never end. So why does the myth persist? Because it's useful. A society that equates heroism with suffering rarely asks who profits from that suffering. The medieval knight bankrupting himself for a suit of armor mirrors the modern soldier paying for their own gear, both trapped in systems that demand everything but give little back. The real lesson of these chronicles isn't about courage, it's about who gets to define it and who pays the price for their definitions. Perhaps true bravery lies not in charging forward, but in finally refusing to. While European chronicles glorified lone knights in shining armor, Japanese samurai tales like the Hike-monogatari celebrated something radically different, loyalty so absolute it bordered on poetry. When the warrior Kumagai Nyazain recognized his enemy as a young boy mirroring his own son, he wept before delivering the fatal blow, then renounced war to become a monk. This moment wasn't framed as weakness but as the pinnacle of Bushido, honor intertwined with humanity. Compare that to the Song of Roland, where mercy is absent and heroism is measured in body counts. The contrast couldn't be starker. One tradition elevates emotional depth as strength, the other scrubs it away as distraction. Islamic chronicles took another path entirely. Persian accounts of Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem dwell not on his battlefield kills, but on his restraint distributing water to parched enemies, forbidding reprisals against civilians. The Kitab al-Itibar by Usama ibn Munki, a 12th century Syrian noble, recounts Muslim and Christian knights exchanging gifts during truces, their mutual respect outweighing religious divides. Where Western tales fixated on individual glory, these narratives framed courage as justice, leadership as stewardship. Even the concept of futuwa, Islamic chivalry, prioritized protecting the vulnerable over personal fame. A hero wasn't who fought hardest, but who governed fairest. African oral traditions like the Epic of Sundiata redefine heroism again. The Mali Empire's founder is remembered not for solo feats, but for unifying fractured kingdoms through diplomacy and wit. His legendary battle against the sorcerer King Saumayoro wasn't won with swords, but by deciphering his enemies' mystical weaknesses through patience and wisdom. Meanwhile, Icelandic sagas like Enjol's saga prized cunning over brute force. Gunnar Hamundason's famed defense at his farm wasn't blind last stand, but a tactical withdrawal gone wrong. His heroism lay in outsmarting foes until fate intervened. These differences expose our uncomfortable truth. Courage isn't universal, but cultural. A samurai's seppuku ritual would baffle a Viking, just as a Bedouin poet warrior's duel of verses would perplex a Frankish knight. The values chroniclers highlighted loyalty, justice, wisdom, reflected what their societies needed most. Europe's fractured feudal landscape bred myths of solitary protectors. Japan's rigid hierarchy demanded unshakable duty. The Islamic world's legal traditions elevated judges over brawlers. Today's action movies still peddle the lone wolf hero, but real-world crises demand Sundiata's unity or Saladin's restraint. Special forces teams train like samurai units trusting bonds over individualism, while peacekeepers prioritize justice over vengeance. Maybe it's time we expanded our definition of bravery beyond swinging swords and last stands, because the medieval chronicles that endure aren't the ones with the most blood, but those that taught their audiences how to live, not just how to die. And that raises a question: whose stories are we still ignoring in our search for heroes? Hollywood's version of the Middle Ages often owes more to medieval propaganda than actual history. Take Braveheart, a film that draped 13th century Scots in kilts and blue face paint, despite tartans not existing for another 300 years and woad being long out of fashion by Wallace's time. The movie's climactic speech about freedom is pure fiction, lifted from chronicles written centuries later by nationalist Scots rewriting their past. Yet these inaccuracies stick because they serve a modern craving for underdog narratives, transforming complex feudal politics into a simple tale of oppression and rebellion. It's not just lazy research, it's the same myth-making machinery medieval scribes used, just with better special effects. Video games double down on these tropes. Assassin's Creed Valhalla lets players raid monasteries as Viking heroes. glossing over the fact that real Norse settlers often converted to Christianity and intermarried with locals. The Total War series turns figures like Attila the Hun into snarling barbarians, ignoring Byzantine accounts of his shrewd diplomacy. These distortions aren't harmless, they reinforce the Samos verses, them binaries that medieval chroniclers weaponized. Why? Because clean narratives sell. A Viking torn between faiths or a Hun negotiating treaties doesn't fit the power fantasy of smashing through history like a conquering demigod. Literature isn't immune. George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire borrows heavily from the Wars of the Roses, yet amplifies the most lurid chronicle tropes: scheming queens, mad kings, and chivalry drowned in blood. The real Margaret of Anjou was a capable strategist, not the shrieking harpy of Shakespeare or Cersei Lannister, but nuance rarely survives adaptation. Even The Lord of the Rings, for all its depth, perpetuates the noble savage myth with its rustic, wisdom-spouting Rohirrim, a romanticized take on Anglo-Saxon chronicles that erased their sophisticated legal codes and trade networks. The endurance of these myths reveals an uncomfortable truth. We prefer our history pre-packaged. Nationalism thrives on simple heroes and villains, whether it's Mel Gibson's Wallace or Russian films casting Alexander Nevsky as a Slavic Superman. Games and films prioritize spectacle over subtlety because no one markets a blockbuster with the tagline, "Historically Accurate Tax Policy Simulator." But the cost is steep. When we reduce the past to fairy tales, we lose the real stakes, the compromises, the contradictions, the humanity. Yet there's hope. Shows like The Last Kingdom, despite its flaws, try to balance drama with archaeology, showing Saxon villages as bustling trade hubs, not mud-spattered hovels. Games like Kingdom Come, Deliverance highlight peasant life alongside swordplay, reminding players that history wasn't just kings and battles. These works prove truth can be gripping if we're willing to let go of the glossy lies. Because the greatest stories aren't the ones that simplify, they're the ones that trust us to handle complexity. And maybe, just maybe, that's a lesson worth taking beyond the screen. Rewriting history isn't about tearing down heroes, it's about restoring their humanity. The moment we start cross-referencing chronicles, a fascinating pattern emerges. Take the case of Richard the Lionheart's ransom. English accounts claim it took 150,000 silver marks to free him, a sum so vast it supposedly bankrupted the kingdom. But peek at French treasury records from the same period, and you'll find no such financial collapse. The real shocker, Arab chronicles suggest the ransom was negotiated down to a fraction of that amount. Suddenly, the myth of England's sacrificial devotion cracks open, revealing a savvy PR move to mask a botched diplomatic mission. This isn't debunking for its own sake, it's detective work that replaces fairy tales with something far richer. Real people navigating impossible choices. The best modern historians embrace this ambiguity like a compass. Tom Holland's Dominion doesn't just retell the Crusades, it dissects how chroniclers twisted them into morality plays, contrasting papal edicts with Jewish survivors' accounts. Similarly, Helen Castor's She-Wolves resurrects medieval queens like Elena of Aquitaine, by reading between the lines of monastic chronicles that dismissed them as schemers. Even documentaries like the BBC's The Plantagenets use forensic archaeology to challenge Tudor propaganda about Richard III, showing how soil analysis of battlefields can rewrite entire chapters. These works don't just present facts, they teach us how to interrogate stories, to spot when a scribe's quill trembles with bias or when an omission speaks louder than 1,000 boasts. Questioning heroic narratives isn't cynicism, it's respect. When we accept Saladin solely as the chivalrous liberator of Jerusalem, we erase his ruthless sieges against Muslim rivals. When we reduce Joan of Arc to a saintly maiden, we ignore her genius for artillery placement that baffled veteran commanders. The most gripping histories live in the grey areas like Dan Jones' The Templars, which reveals how these monk warriors balanced banking empires with vows of poverty, or Bettany Hughes' Istanbul, which uncovers Byzantine emperors who borrowed Islamic medicine while waging holy wars. These layers don't diminish greatness, they make it tangible. So where do we start? Grab two accounts of the same event, say, the Norman conquest from both the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and William of Poitiers' Gesta Guillermi. Note where they agree the date of Hastings, where they diverge Harold's legitimacy, and where they go suspiciously silent the mass killings post-battle. That friction isn't confusion, it's the spark of real understanding. And when you stumble on contradictions, relish them. Maybe El Cid really did fight for both Christians and Muslims, not as a traitor, but as a man navigating a fractured world where allegiances were as fluid as borders. The call isn't to abandon admiration, but to deepen it. Behind every polished legend lies a mosaic of grit, compromise, and quiet triumph scribes never thought to record. Our task isn't to smash the mosaic, but to study each tessera, the chipped edges and odd colors until the full picture emerges, because history isn't a hall of statues. It's a conversation across time, and we honor it most when we listen closely enough to hear the whispers between the shouts. The ink-stained pages of medieval chronicles reveal a truth far more telling than any list of battles or kings. They expose the deepest fears and wildest dreams of the people who wrote them. Every exaggerated victory, every airbrushed flaw, every invented lineage was a mirror held up to the anxieties and aspirations of an era. When scribes turned Viking traders into mindless brutes or painted Saladin as both demon and saint, they weren't just recording history, they were wrestling with their own uncertainties about identity, power, and morality. These distortions weren't failures of fact, they were symptoms of humanity. A monk exaggerating Saxon savagery might have been justifying his monastery's land grabs. A court poet spinning Arthur into a messianic figure could have been soothing a nation reeling from invasion. The lies weren't random, they were survival strategies etched onto parchment. Debunking these myths doesn't diminish the past, it electrifies it, peeling away the layers of legend to find a mercenary like El Cid, negotiating with both Christian and Muslim rulers, doesn't make him less remarkable, it makes him real. A man navigating a fractured world with pragmatism and grit is far more inspiring than a cardboard cutout of perfection. When we uncover Joan of Arc's tactical brilliance beyond her visions, or Richard the Lionheart's logistical failures beneath his lionized reputation, we're not tearing down heroes, we're meeting them. History stops being a gallery of marble statues and becomes a crowded tavern full of complex, flawed, fascinating people just trying to survive their century. The danger comes when we cling too tightly to these polished legends. As historian Patrick Geary once warned, to idolize the past is to paralyze the present. We end up fighting ghosts instead of building futures. The medieval chroniclers who turned warriors into demigods weren't just writing stories, they were building cages for generations to come. How many young knights died pointlessly because they'd been raised on tales of reckless glory? How many policies today are still shaped by romanticized versions of crusades or conquests? The past stops teaching us when we insist on seeing it as a parade of heroes and villains rather than a tapestry of hard choices and unintended consequences. So here's to the messy, contradictory, gloriously human truth behind the myths. Tell us in the comments which medieval legend did you once believe, only to discover the reality was even more interesting. And if you've enjoyed this journey through the shadowy gap between history and legend, hit subscribe. because the past is full of stories waiting to be unpacked, and we've only just